Kyrle is now known as the Man of Ross. During his lifetime, which was quite a long life, 87 I think he was when he died, and during his life while he was here, he lived a rather unusual life really, because he was sort of partly gentry but not quite there, so he led a very modest life, and he had a small income of around 500 a year.
He was not a wealthy man, but he gave what he could to enrich the town.
John Kyrle was born actually in Dimmock in Gloucestershire in 1637. He was educated in Gloucester, and he went on to college at Oxford University to study law. But in fact, he never actually finished his training as a lawyer. And by that time, his parents had moved into Ross, and they moved into the big house opposite the marketplace. So he really spent the rest of his life in Ross. He helped the poor, he helped the people who were ill. He set up a pharmacy to hand out medicines, and he also increasingly got involved in legal matters, and himself did buy and sell properties, so he made a bit of extra money doing that. A bit of a wheeler dealer, really. But he remained single all his life. He was never actually responsible for doing anything himself. He always managed to initiate a group of men, i.e. from the parish, and to do various things for Ross. And at the time, as I said earlier, because of the plague and the Civil War, things were a bit dilapidated and run down. So one of the things he did was to replace or rebuild the causeway which leads from Wilton Bridge up into Ross, where there'd been a lot of tragedy because of the flooding down there, so they needed to rebuild it. Here, where we are at the moment in the prospect, he leased this from the Duke of Weymouth, Lord Weymouth, and he decided that this was a bit of waste ground here, which had originally been the Bishop's Bank, where the Bishop's Palace had been in the 12th century. And he thought this would make a grand place for the community to come and enjoy. So he laid it out with gardens, and he laid out paths, and he put in a fountain, and he made it a very attractive place for people to come. And it was a lot bigger then. It was twice the size that it is today. And one of the other great achievements was he brought fresh water into the town. So if you go down to the river, down near the Hope and Anchor Inn, there was a big giant water wheel that was set up there, and the water wheel would pump the water, and then it would pump it up here through elm pipes, and it would be available in the fountain for people to collect water. And it was also distributed through the pipes into certain places in the town so people could get fresh water. So he was really the first person to bring fresh water into the town. There was a tradition in Ross that had a long tradition of charitable men and women who had, during their lifetime, when they left in their wills, various bequests to the church, to hospitals, to educational places, and to the poor. Kyrle really continued with this, and he did support the various charitable institutions that were around at that time. So he added to it and helped them raise funds, etc. So that's why he became known as the Man of Ross, because he was helping the townspeople, basically.
And Alexander Pope, in his poem, picks up on this fact that wealthy men like to be thought of as being charitable because they've got the money, but he was different. John Kyrle was a different man. He wanted to be a benefactor without having huge resources to do it. And I think he's an inspiration.
There were several benefactors to the town. One was James Hall, who was instrumental in bringing the railway to Ross. He also set up a dispensary in the town and was involved in the British and foreign school. Walter Scott was a Ross boy who left the town and went to London and made his fortune. But he always remembered where he had received his education at the Bluecoat School, and in his will he left his considerable fortune to endow the school. Nathaniel Morgan was a prominent Quaker at Ross. He was involved in setting up the Ross and Archenfield Bank, the British and Foreign School, and remodelling the Quaker meeting house. Thomas Blake was probably the man who did most for the town.
Two of the most interesting things that I hold about the Blake family are indentures belonging to two boys that went off for their apprenticeships at the age of 14. One in 1799, when he started with a founder in London. A founder was a person who knew how to melt metal and pour it into moulds, and he was trained in this. And when he had finished, he didn't go into that business but joined the Bengal Artillery for 7 or 8 years. Coming back to Ross in 1814, he married Mary Cator. And he and Mary started a very smart little family with 6 children. They had 2 girls and 4 boys. And of these, probably the best well-known of their children is Thomas. Thomas was the youngest child, but Thomas made the biggest impact on Ross, probably, of any Blake, the building of the Baptist church. He financed that very largely, the organising of the prospect for the town.
And he bought it. He bought the prospect, and he did actually give it to the town, so it became the town's property. And it's a lovely area of the town.
The purchase of the public library in Broad Street, that was another of his. And as the century went on, we came to the 1860s when all the public pumping places in Ross had been closed down because of contaminated water. And there was a search for 20 years or more for drinkable water in Ross, and no one could find it. But my grandfather, let's work from the other way round, Thomas's nephew, he found water, and it was located in what we now know as Tank Meadow. And Thomas was willing to buy the field where it was found, and the farmer would only sell the whole farm. And Thomas went ahead and bought the farm so that he could secure the water. And a small pumping station was put up down in the bottom of Tank Meadow, pumping the water right up to the very crown of the hill. You can still go there today and see the reservoir hidden in the trees where the water was secured and then fed by gravity to Ross. But also Christmas time, he was anonymously giving food and bread and money to the poor. For 30 years, anonymously, he gave money into the almshouses and to people who were there that was unknown. And even in his last months, he died in March 1901, it is said that over that Christmas and through that winter, he was still seen walking round the town, giving away bread, helping those who were poor any way he could.
Homelessness has always been a problem, and because it was switched from the church to the government, it was the only way that they could do it was to establish these huge, great workhouses, which were pretty grim, I have to say. If you read anything about them, it was not a good place to go. You didn't want to go there if you could avoid it.
The workhouse in Ross was established in 1838 and ran through till about 1930 when the union workhouse system was abolished, by which time it was mainly housing elderly, infirm people?
Times were certainly hard. There was nothing being given away in those days at all. You know, if you had nothing, you had nothing. It was after the days of the old workhouse. I mean, sort of luckily I was born after those days. Otherwise, we could have ended up in the workhouse. If you had nothing, that was the only place to go.
Yeah, you had yes. There was no the support systems weren't there. They didn't exist. Certainly here, anyway.
We didn't recognise it as poverty as such because it wasn't much different to the rest of us. But generally, if you lived in Tudorville Crescent, it was, I wouldn't say looked down on, but you could almost be sure that the people that lived down there were not well off, that there was poverty because the sort of jobs they did didn't pay much.
And most of the ladies were working, of course. I remember my mother worked in the munitions factory at Hereford. And then when sort of she finished there, they'd go and work on the fields, picking up potatoes and picking peas and whatever was going. Because as I say, the men were away and up until 46, 47. So, you know, things were quite hard, but we survived. There was always a great big bowl of stew on the table for a stew, the odd rabbit in there and things. I think I was 14 at the time, and someone suggested that you could earn your school uniform by going hop picking. So I hop picked for 2 weeks. You actually had 2 extra weeks off school for hop picking. And then during that period, you had all the travellers coming through with their caravans and horse-drawn, and the ladies with big baskets walking by the side of the horses, and they would all travel up from South Wales and from Somerset and all sorts of places to actually pick hops within the local area.
Like Brian, I remember it as being a time of hardship, really, in many ways. That, as Brian said, there were no televisions, we had radios, and that was about it. And there was no such thing as a central heating system. It didn't exist. You had coal fires. And we live in the house that I live in now, and that was a rented building at the time. And there were 2 coal fires, and that was it. So there was no hot running water for a bath. If you wanted a bath, you had to get hot water from downstairs and carry it upstairs in a bucket and fill the bath.
Well, compared to today, it was idyllic. I mean, it was literally a case of you get up in the morning, have your breakfast, go out and come back at tea time, and just hope your mother didn't find out what you were doing in between, you know. But we used to play on the railway line. Used to play up in Chase Woods.
Yeah, they were good days, really good days. Thoroughly enjoyed them as a child. You could do more as a child in them days. There was no television, obviously. Sort of lucky if you had a wireless, but we enjoyed ourselves just living around, and there was all sorts of things you could find: blackberries and sort of moorhen's eggs, duck's eggs, mushrooms in the fields. So you could always get something to eat. And of course, a lot of rabbits about in those days. So if you could snare the odd rabbit, you had a good Sunday lunch.
We were out in the countryside all the time. I would just come in, holiday times, I would come in for maybe about 5 minutes at lunchtime and then off up into the woods.
We didn't realise it at the time. We didn't have much money, but we managed, and people ate really well. In fact, during the war when rationing was on, it didn't really worry us too much because Dad would go out and catch rabbit.
But people looked after one another more then than what they do now. Everyone, I was brought up in the old nursery, and there was 58 houses in the nursery. You knew everybody there, and if you wanted a bit of bread and jam, you could virtually go into everybody's house and get a bit of bread and jam. And all the families really looked after. If there was any problems in the families, someone would look after the kids, and sort of any deaths or anything, sort of a real community. The old nursery was, believe me, a real community.
I don't think there was much in the way of governmental help. It was very much down to family and friends, looking after one another.
I remember an old tramp used to come to our house in the nursery, and he'd turn up about 7 o'clock in the morning with his billy can, and Dad would by then have put the kettle on, and to give him a billy can of water so he could make his tea, sort of. Incidentally, where we lived in the nursery, there was one tap for 3 people.
So often the child depended heavily upon what the mother could do. And there was this sort of disjointed family life of such people. The man would spend the money on what he wished, and the wife would have to cope with what was left.
People didn't eat out that much
No.
because they didn't have any money, basically. I mean, they talk about hardship now, I guess, but that was really...
Well, people got on with it. I know, sort of, they just say, if you were hard up, you did everything, you'd walk up the fields and dig yourself a swede, wouldn't you? You could always make a soup with a swede and a few potatoes.
That's true.
Because they were growing all around us. Everybody then had either an allotment or they grew stuff with the little patch they had. I remember our old house in the nursery, and it was sort of when Dad come back home after the war, he opened up the side patch as a vegetable patch. So we lived off that. But things were very tight right through into the 60s. I always think probably the middle 60s, and I've discussed this with my wife Shirley, that it wasn't until about the middle 60s we began to see our head coming above the water, and things gradually got better from the mid 60s onwards. And wages obviously were beginning to get better. There was industry invited into the town, so there was more money in the town through the small factories that started up. And where the money was at Mitcheldean, where Ranks were, big money at Ranks. If you could get a job at Ranks, you'd really begin to make the grade,
So I ended up with an apprenticeship at what was Rank Precision Industries at Mitcheldean. Eventually became Rank Xerox, and I was there for 28 years, I suppose.
Well, Rank Xerox, when that moved into the Forest of Dean, people couldn't believe the money, There
was over 5,000 people there at one time, so that provided a decent income for a lot of us. Made the town more prosperous than it was when I was a child.
I think they were a London company, and they moved into the Forest of Dean, still pay and run this London rate.
But a lot of that, I think, is not so much Ross itself as the fact that people have moved in who are able to commute nowadays. I mean, when the M50 was built, we had people living in Ross that worked at Longbridge in Birmingham. They used to commute up the M50 every day.
Different people, an expanded population, and less cohesion.
Yes, there has been a big influx of people who have come from other areas, and they can commute.
Because we are slowly seeing the erosion of country life. It's becoming urbanized, and therefore we are losing this sense of we're a community. Because you can see new houses built several years ago up for sale because they've moved on. Whereas, as I say, I could come back all those years later and find people I'd baptised or confirmed still in Ross.
Community is different today. There is a lot of community activity going on, but it has changed in as much as it's kind of fragmented.
So as for where people get help today, even families are so disjointed now that I'm not sure if you could get help from your family. But that would be the first call, certainly in 1960, the family.
That's why we've got things like food banks, which we didn't have when I was a kid. The food banks, if you like, in those days were next door neighbour's garden, and it was given to you by the neighbour. But today, people have got to go to food banks, and it's a tragedy. I think that people should be in a situation where they need to do that.
Community larder first opened in May 2011. I tell you, in the first 6 months of this year, we served 634 adults and 512 children. Originally, the need was mainly amongst single young men, but these days it's families who come to us. 300 years ago, John Kyrle was giving out bread to those in need. Not a lot has changed in 300 years, and I think that's really sad.
We have all sorts of needs that have arisen really since the financial crisis in 2008 and the austerity that followed that. So the welfare provision, I think particularly for children and for young people, has declined significantly in that time.
I do think Ross is pretty special. I've lived all over the country, and Ross still has got a real strong community spirit. I do think there are still people that are outside of the community and that struggle to be brought into the community, and we do tend to get quite a few of those people coming to the hub. And that can be because of mental health, addiction issues, domestic abuse, childhood trauma. And I've worked in a lot of those remits. So I think we offer something that I don't think anyone else does in Ross, but it's all the jigsaw puzzle pieces put together that creates a whole community. So it's just trying to build upon that sort of community resilience and strengthen people to strengthen themselves and move forward with life. The plants make the place, don't they? Poverty has a lot of different faces. So it can be fuel poverty now, it can be food poverty, but it can also be emotional poverty. And I think, especially after COVID, the world changed and people felt extremely isolated. And I think emotional poverty can be just as damaging as the other poverties, and we try to enrich people's lives. I've worked at so many church halls, and they're not bright and they're not jolly. And I just wanted something that people could come in and be proud of and really enjoy their own space. We were about the only family in our street that had a freezer. So quite often, my mum would receive a letter from a neighbour up the road that had like 13 kids, and it'd be, can you just lend me half a pound of sausages? Can you lend me a couple of chips? And this is a real, can you lend me a cup of sugar place, you know? People in need are often the most giving people.
In 2013, we heard about a small plot of land, 2.5 acres in the centre of Ross, that became available to rent. And Haygrove, a horticultural company, a grower based in Ledbury, wanted to set up a community garden in the county. And we thought this was an ideal site to support people in our local community who were struggling for whatever reason, and ideally through a green space to add some horticultural therapy and to support people in Ross and Wye and the villages around. So it was quite overgrown at the start, and we started to tidy it up and to put some structure in place, some paths and some tunnels, and some areas for coffee and tea, and before we know it, we started inviting people into the site, and many adults with learning difficulties at the start, anyone with a mental health illness, those who are long-term unemployed as well, we started to support. But over the years it's become more well known, and we have lots of children who visit the garden now, about 900 each year from local primary schools. We've set up a zero waste stall where we're collecting surplus food, and hopefully trying to get that food to people who are sort of struggling in our financial crisis at the moment. I think most importantly it's about creating a safe place where anyone is welcome, creating opportunities where people can be themselves. I guess it's mainly those who find themselves quite isolated in society, so anyone working through a mental illness, depression, PTSD, stress, anxiety. Those are the folk I feel get probably most out of this site. But if you were here on a school day and there were 30 children from a local primary school, I reckon they'd be getting quite a bit out of this project as well. So for me, it's for the whole of the community.
The pandemic and the lockdowns that the pandemic brought about did bring about quite a big change in several ways. First of all, there was this massive response from people who came forward at that time to volunteer with help with shopping for people who were isolating or prescription deliveries. And what we saw was the coming together of several groups in Ross, like the Lions, the Rotary, the Baptist Church was also involved, and they gave us free use of their premises, for example. All working in a coordinated way to make sure that the community itself was able to respond to the problems that lockdown brought.
I don't think it's about philanthropy, or is it? I think it's just about being a decent person. I think it's just about you've got to pass the bowl to make the food go round, and that's that, and that's something everyone should do. I think philanthropy springs up very grandiose ideas of having a lot of money and helping the less fortunate. When it comes to it, I've probably got the same sort of income as a lot of the people that I'm helping. But that shouldn't distinguish those who help. I think the one thing that's changed is it did very much used to be the rich people that helped the poor. And I think what we're about is getting normal people to support normal people so that snowball effect continues.